Hello everyone watching, and welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be going over my new predictions for the Conservative leadership election in the United Kingdom. Now, in the last video that I made on this, I said I believe that Mordaunt would defeat Sunak or Truss in the final. I had originally predicted that of the four major candidates at the time who seemed like they were able to win, I predicted Sunak would come first out of the parliamentary ballot, followed by Mordaunt, Truss, and then Badenoch, which would have meant Badenoch being eliminated, then Truss being eliminated, and then Sunak losing to Mordaunt in the members' vote. However, that's not what happened. Mordaunt was essentially targeted by the furthest right mainstream newspapers in the United Kingdom, who generally come to support right-wing conservative candidates. In this case, they're widely thought to be backing Liz Truss. And in the leadership election, I'm just going to scroll down here so you can see what I guess I'm pointing to. Throughout the leadership election, there were two candidates in the lead, Rishi Sunak and then Penny Mordaunt. And everyone originally thought that that meant it was likely that Mordaunt would consolidate the center to left wing of the party, getting some possible endorsements from Nadhim Zahawi, Jeremy Hunt, Tom Tugendhat, while Liz Truss would consolidate the right wing of the party, essentially Kemi Badenoch and Suella Braverman behind her campaign, and that would possibly lead to a Truss Mordaunt's final scenario. There was the other option of Truss not consolidating the right wing, which would have led to a Sunak versus Mordaunt essentially runoff election. However, neither of those happened. In the first round, which is when I made the video, Zahawi and Hunt were eliminated, and as I expected, most of their support went to Mordaunt and Sunak, as you can see here. However, one thing that was probably not noted enough was that between this round here, the first battle on the 13th of July, and the next day, the 14th of July, Liz Truss also gained 14 votes. This is very, very, very surprising. Essentially, people thought that possibly some Zahawi and Hunt voters decided to go to more moderate candidates like Tugendhat, while some Tugendhat or maybe Braverman, especially voters, maybe Badenoch voters, went to Liz Truss. Then, after, as I had expected, Suella Braverman was eliminated, we went to the third ballot. And on the third ballot, another surprising thing happened. Well, Suella was eliminated, which should theoretically have been a gain for Truss and Badenoch. And Badenoch did gain, gaining 9 votes, right? And Truss gained, gaining 7. But there was something that was coming up which was about to essentially end Mordaunt's chances of making it to the final round, which was Mordaunt lost votes. Mordaunt wasn't expected to gain any votes from Suella being on the center left of the party versus Suella being on the right wing to far right of the party. However, not only did Mordaunt lose votes, but Tugendhat also lost votes. Tugendhat is also in the center to center left of the party, which meant that while the center to center left of the party shrunk essentially, we saw Rishi Sunak emerge as the biggest winner of the day, being in the center to center right of the party, gaining 14 votes, and of course Liz Truss and Badenoch both on the right wing gaining 7 and 9 votes respectively. Now this was the most intriguing round, arguably the fourth ballot, because this was where Tugendhat's voters would decide who would go to the next round. By this point, almost everyone assumed that the final three would be Sunak, Truss, and Mordaunt, Kemi having failed to effectively challenge Truss for the right wing of the party. Badenoch was eliminated as expected, and Mordaunt did indeed gain but a significant amount of Tugendhat's voters. And Sunak did gain a few, but what surprised everyone the most was that Truss managed to gain 15. 15 MPs is quite a lot, and was actually the second biggest jump seen to this point, only following when two candidates were eliminated in round 1. Heading into the final round, many Mordaunt backers essentially expected her to lose, because while she had started off in such a dominating second position, as you can see here, Mordaunt was getting closer and closer to Truss, and Truss was now looking to pass her. With the candidate on the right wing being eliminated, Truss should have been able to effectively consolidate the right wing vote. However, Truss didn't actually consolidate the right wing vote. Truss gained a plurality of arguably the bad knock voters, but Mordaunt was actually able to gain 13 and Sunak able to gain 19, which left us in a very, very close race, not only for second, but indeed for first. Because Truss was only, 24 behind Sunak, and Mordaunt was even less behind Truss. So that clearly shows you your three-way split. You've got your center of the party, essentially, uh, not the old school conservatives, but mostly those, blue wall, uh, small c conservatives, essentially. That's around 38% of the party, supposedly, of the MPs who are elected. You have your right wing of the party, your hardline Brexiteers in arguably the northwest and east of England, and of course the east of England, and possibly also the Midlands. And of course, you've also got your red wall seats, your very small seat conservatives arguably heading closer and closer towards the Liberal Democrats, mainly the few Tory MPs from Scotland, many of those red wall MPs, as I said, many of the MPs, or I guess all two of them in Wales, um, and also some of the MPs in London, which is traditionally a very small C conservative area when Conservatives win. Which leads me to, well, how's it looking? What do we see in the polls? And when we go to polls in that forecasted head-to-head matchup, there's really only been three, all by YouGov. The first poll happened way back on the 6th to the 7th of July, and Truss won 43% to 38%, with 19% undecided. Then again, they did one later, 6 days later, from the 12th to the 13th of July, which resulted in an absolute shellacking, with Truss obtaining 59% of the vote. But that seemed too high, so they ran another one, and that showed 54 to 35%. But how could this be? If we already know that, just looking at the numbers, you saw that Mordaunt was able to achieve a very high proportion of the vote. And Sunak is supposed to be on the center of the party, and he won around 38%. And Truss is supposed to be on the right of the party, winning 31%. So why is there so much popular support behind Truss? And this essentially brings us to how we know if Truss or Sunak is going to win. Either Truss is going to run against the unpopular Sunak as the anti-Sunak candidate to the public at large. If she successfully does this, I believe she wins. However, Sunak could also run against Truss as the stop this crazy right-wing conservatism campaign, I guess, the anti-Truss / Thatcher campaign. And I think that would resonate very well with conservatives in more moderate areas, much more moderate conservatives. And I think that means that if Sunak does win, it will mean many more Daunt voters back him. And I think if Truss wins, it won't be more Daunt voters backing Truss. It will rather be more Daunt voters going against Sunak. However, there's one bit of good news for conservatives in the United Kingdom right now, which is since Boris Johnson resigned, which was the low point of conservatives in around 2 years, the Conservatives have started to rebound, mainly at the cost of the Lib Dems in most polls. Which brings us to this. This is electoral calculus, and it essentially brings me to the big point I want to make today, which is tactical voting. And I don't mean tactical voting for the Conservative leadership election, no, I mean tactical voting for the United Kingdom general election that is supposed to happen in 2024-2025. Now, in this election, I think currently this is where the numbers stand if Truss were to win. And that's because I simply believe Truss to be the more likely candidate to win right now. So that's where we're going to start. Now, I think that right now, the Conservatives probably win around 30% of the vote, 35% for Labour, 20% for the Lib Dems, some negligible amount for the Reform Party, and 10% of the vote for the Greens. And I think this because many conservative voters in the southern regions of England are going to support the more moderate Lib Dems, or in some cases, they're going to be much more concerned about the environment with the new heat records, and I think that helps the Greens. I think the Reform Party essentially dies out, formerly the Brexit Party, simply because not only is Brexit gone, but now there's someone very close to their ideology as leader of the much like Conservative Party. I think one of the most notable areas, though, is Scotland, where I think the Conservatives lose an insanely large proportion of their voters. And I think this because, one, the Conservative vote will now no longer be a tactical vote. Previously in Scotland, the Conservatives were seen as the second largest party behind the Scottish Nationalist Party, and they drew many tactical voters in southern Scotland and northeastern Scotland from Liberal Democrat voters and Labour voters. Even though Scotland is very left-wing, this meant that some right-wing, or at least center-right, people were elected. However, I think that if Truss were to become the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and therefore the next Prime Minister who's on the ballot in 2024 in the United Kingdom, I think the Conservatives do terribly. This is because Scotland absolutely hates anyone who compares themselves favorably to Margaret Thatcher, and they also hate Boris Johnson. He literally had a negative 70% approval rate. Like, he had 70% disapproval, only 20% approval, with 10% undecided. That is horrendous. If Boris Johnson had such a bad approval rating, I think it's not hard to see how someone possibly further right-wing would do even worse. I also think Keir Starmer generally holds the Labour vote, and I think, of course, you've got your more moderate Conservatives going to the Lib Dems. I also think there's a lot of tactical voting from these two groups here, the Lib Dems and Labour, who really hate the Conservatives and therefore vote for the SNP because they think that independence isn't a realistic option. I think independence becoming a realistic option may happen further down the campaign, but for now at least, I think this is the current state. But one of the most important things is tactical voting. I think realistically there's not a scenario that has no tactical voting. So we're going to start here. In this scenario, you have your normal tactical voting, essentially. What happened in 2019 that backfired so spectacularly for Labour, the Lib Dems, and the Greens, the three left-wing, center-left, centrist forces in the United Kingdom. In this scenario where there's, a moderate level of tactical voting, I think right now you have a hung problem. If we go to the map, you essentially see it looks very similar, the previous election result and the current one. The only difference is that you have a few more Liberal Democrat seats in Scotland, and you have many more SNP seats, mostly from Conservatives. You also have in Northern England, essentially the old red wall kind of falls apart. But there still isn't enough support for the Labour Party to actually win a majority, although they do win the most votes. I think the Lib Dems are probably a coalition partner of Labour in this government, roughly mirroring 2010 when the Lib Dems were a coalition partner of the Conservatives. Next, we come to the Unite Against Truss, essentially, campaign. In this scenario, you have your Labour voters, Lib Dems, and your Greens, and they all get together, and there's special sites that tell you which MP to vote for tactically. Essentially what we saw in the recent by-elections, where Labour would stand candidates against both the Lib Dems and Conservatives, but then spend no money there, so that all the Labour voters there would end up backing the Lib Dems, and vice versa. And in this scenario, I think that Labour is probably a very similar amount short, but they do slightly better. The real gainers in this scenario are actually the Lib Dems. I think it's a relatively similar map, but you do see a notable change in certain areas of the country, mostly southern and central England. This area right here, this is a very strong Lib Dem area in a scenario with this high amounts of tactical voting. And lastly, the last scenario, this is essentially almost a coalition. This is where Labour, Lib Dem, and the Greens get together right before the election and they look at polls. And the polls say that while they would individually have a very tough time getting a government, they do better to unite together. This coalition has been discussed before, mostly by Lib Dem and Green supporters anxious to get into government, and mostly brushed off by Labour, who say they can win on their own. But as we just saw, that's very unlikely when they have such a little support base in Scotland, which is essentially required for them to form governments. In this scenario, I think you do have a Labour majority and you have a substantial Liberal Democrat presidency. I think that this is probably the least likely scenario out of the three I suggested, but it's very possible. I think that, of course, you have your central and southern England voters choosing the Liberal Democrats, while in northern England and the Midlands you have Labour supporters, as well as Wales. I think the Conservatives lose all their seats in Wales and Scotland in pretty much all these scenarios. So next, let's talk about Rishi Sunak. Rishi Sunak, I think, versus the old Liz Truss conservative predictions, he does a tiny bit better. He has roughly 35% of the vote, and he importantly does significantly better in Scotland. I think that he probably loses some votes to Labour, however, because those more centrist, pro-Remain, liberal, Democrat, conservative swing voters, they probably are going to back him a bit more. But he's going to lose votes to Labour because he doesn't appeal to that working class background that Boris Johnson somehow was able to, and Truss also somehow was able to do. Despite none of the three of them being there, Truss and Boris Johnson have a much better reputation with those red wall seats. So, in this scenario, I think that you do end up with a very close race. I think that in this scenario, you essentially have a very, very close race between Labour and the Conservatives. And I think that just as before, Labour is going to have a coalition with the Lib Dems. However, arguably the most important thing to mention here is that Labour is going to make significant gains in Scotland. This is because Sunak isn't like Truss, in that Sunak, while maybe idealistically comparing himself to Thatcher, is not seen as anywhere close to as bad as Thatcher in Scotland, whereas Truss is seen as essentially a Thatcher reincarnated in Scotland. So I think that Labour gains many seats in the Glasgow and Edinburgh areas, and I think that in the red wall seats, Labour gains many, many seats as well. However, as you notice, there's a distinct lack of orange here that we just recently noticed in the past scenario. And I think that this is simply because the Lib Dems require a very right-wing person, and Labour requires a much more small-c conservative person to run against. In the next scenario, we see some slight cooperation, not the zero cooperation of the last one. This is, your very slight cooperation between the different groups. And I think that in this scenario, you have an extremely, extremely close race. I'm not making predictions for how many exact seats, but I think you have an almost exact race. I think that if Labour is one short of a majority, for example, like basically zero, they can potentially form a coalition with the Greens, which is probably more appetizing to Labour, because Labour and the Greens share many economic platforms. Realistically, they only differ on climate change. They could also potentially, if needed, pick up some support on certain votes from the SNP, or the Lib Dems, or Plaid Cymru, or some of the left-wing to center-left Northern Irish parties. I think in this scenario, just like the last one, of course, Scotland is going to have a lot more red seats, but something that we're still noticing is there's even more red seats up here than there were last time, but the Conservatives are still holding some seats in Wales, in Scotland, and they're also still holding off the Liberal Democrats in Southern England. In the last scenario, this is, of course, your heightened levels of cooperation between the left-wing parties, but there's no coalition against Truss, nowhere near what I guess we're talking about Truss. I don't think that there's realistically a coalition against Sunak because the Liberal Democrats probably have as much in common with the Greens as they would Sunak. I think they're maybe slightly left-wing, but the Liberal Democrats are very centrist. They're not realistically left-wing, whereas a Sunak center-right government would be roughly as bad as a Keir Starmer center-left government. In this scenario, I think Labour ends up with a slight majority, but once again, it's very small. I think most importantly is that in Scotland you have many, many more Labour and Lib Dem seats, and you still end up with essentially no Lib Dem seats in the south of England. Now, they get a few, such as here, and some southeastern England and some London area seats, notable areas around colleges like Cambridge, Oxford, but realistically, Lib Dems aren't doing too well in this scenario, mostly because, once again, that's the big takeaway. Labour needs some sort of centrist, very rich, raise taxes conservative to run against because it will inspire that red wall base to vote against the Conservatives and therefore for Labour. Whereas the Liberal Democrats need a very right-wing person to scare the much better educated areas of England to vote Liberal Democrat. Now, of course, this could all be rendered useless. It is entirely possible that Truss wins or Sunak wins, and there's no technical voting, or maybe there's a party that collapses. Possibly, maybe you have the SNP take a ton of their votes and give them to Labour, essentially. You could see an SNP Labour coalition fairly easily. I think the SNP is unlikely to do that. I think an SNP Green coalition in Scotland could potentially net the SNP a few more seats. And of course, there's always regional coalitions, such as the Liberal Democrat Green Plaid Cymru pro-Remain coalition at the 2019 election. I think you could see potentially in certain regions, such as London or southern England, coalitions just like that, with the Liberal Democrats forming coalitions, maybe seat to seat with the Labour, the Green Party, and potentially even against very left-wing Labour MPs with the Conservatives. So there's my take. I have no idea who will win the Conservative leadership election right now, but I can tell you that tactical voting and whoever wins this will make an impact. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.